I was born in a country that is no more. It was then the Sudetenland and the buffer zone between Germany and Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland is the historical German name for the western region of Czechoslovakia, which was inhabited primarily by Sudeten Germans since the Middle Ages. The Sudetenland became a major source of contention between Germany and Czechoslovakia, and in 1938, participants at the Munich conference, yielding to Adolf Hitler, the Sudetenland was transferred to Germany. The name Sudeten was derived from the mountain range located in northern Bohemia and Moravia. The Sudetenland, a German community for over 500 years, was completely depopulated and replaced by Czech and Slovak families in February 1945. And it became part of Czechoslovakia, which it is till today. German families became refugees and left their country with just their clothes on their back. My mother and I were among those people. The term Third Reich was used to describe the Nazi regime in Germany from 1933 to May 1945. The Nazi rise to power marked the beginning of the Third Reich. It brought an end to the Weimar Republic, which was a parliamentary democracy established and defeated Germany after World War I. When Hitler and the Nazi Party controlled Germany, the country was transformed to a dictatorship, and under Hitler's rule, Germany very quickly became a totalitarian state, where all aspects of life were controlled by the German government. After World War I, Germany suffered great losses of territory and stiff reparations. It was a dismal time for the Germans. No food, no work, and the inflation was so unbelievably high that what little money people still had wouldn't buy anything. The exchange of the dollar to the German mark was in the millions. My cousin Florentine, who was a little girl then, remembered that it took a wheelbarrow of money to buy a loaf of bread. This was the situation which the Nazi Party and Hitler took advantage of. They promised people work, better living conditions, food, less inflation, a home, and possibly even a Volkswagen. You can see why the Germans voted for this party and thus put Adolf Hitler into power as sole chancellor. Actually, all the things they promised, they delivered. Under Hitler, the economic situation in Germany improved almost overnight. No wonder people adored him. Hitler was a master manipulator. He relied on images and symbols like the swastika, das Hakenkreuz, and elaborate shows of power. Drawing people from all over Germany, he promised discipline, order, and power, all displayed in his symbols. Hitler was an exceptional orator with great talent for public speaking. I remember sitting on the sidewalk and watching the enraptured faces of people listening to his speeches, which were going over loudspeakers in every town, on every corner, on every street corner the loudspeakers were. All his speeches were always transmitted over loudspeakers for all the population to hear them. He had the people spellbound with his hypnotic oratory. One Volk, one people, one Reich, empire, and one Führer, one leader. The propaganda was so unreal, and it riled the people up. Hitler's speeches bordered on religious fanaticism. The military units marched and they sang on top of their lungs. I still remember it. Die Fahne hoch, die Reihen fest geschlossen, SA marschiert in unseren Reihen mit, and the flags and the swastika fluttered in the wind. It was a propaganda of persuasion and a show of power. The Enabling Act was passed by the parliament and gave Adolf Hitler the power to pass his own laws. The SA, the Sturmabteilung, the Gestapo, the police, and the SS, the Sicherheitsabteilung, were Hitler's agents of control and chaos also. Hitler used all of them to establish a dominant and fearful power. It was always present in Germany during the war. The focus of the state was anti-Semitism. Jewish businesses were boycotted, and all the propaganda was directed against the Jews. The regime in Germany was modeled after the medieval and early modern Holy Roman Empire of the 1800s. The Nazi project sought to restore Germany to its former imperial splendor. They called themselves the Master Race. From 1936 on, the lands which were lost after the First World War were being regained. The Sudetenland and the Rhineland were returned to Germany, and Austria was also annexed because there were always German-speaking people there. 1939, the Czech government was given an ultimatum either to join Germany or to be destroyed. And of course, they decided to join Germany. When Germany invaded Poland, Hitler should have been stopped by England. The treaty after the First World War forbid Germany to bear arms. Had they been stopped by Chamberlain, the world would have been better off. But the English did nothing, and they stood back and let it happen. Hitler also signed a non-aggression pact with Russia during that time. In 1940, Germany conquered the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Holland, and Belgium, and France followed the same year. German soldiers shipped home to Germany French wines, chocolates, antiques, expensive paintings, and all other collectibles. From Poland, they shipped to Germany slave labor to work in their factories. Hitler also offered Britain a non-aggression pact, and he did that repeatedly, but they did not take his offer. Germany attacked Britain viciously, but the Royal Air Force defended the country vigorously, and the British did not give up the fight. My grandmother had 4 prisoners of war working for her in her vineyards on the weekends. There was an Italian and a French boy and 2 Russians. And my grandmother treated them very well. Matter of fact, I remember that they ate with the family, whatever we had to eat. And this kindness paid off at the end of the war. The assault on Russia was called Operation Barbarossa. It began in 1941. German troops invaded Stalingrad, and the Germans believed in an early victory. Our destiny is pushing us to victory, and there is never any doubt that we will win. On their way to Russia, the German troops exterminated over 4,000 Jews in Latvia. By the end of 1941, 1 million Jews were killed. The army's tactic was blitzkrieg, but Russia was Germany's way to defeat. The winter made it impossible to get supplies to the German armies. My father was missing in action in Stalingrad, and he never returned from the war. The fall of the Third Reich began with the attack of Russia. I experienced the victory march of the Russians through Czechoslovakia into East Germany. They took everything along, and nothing was safe from them. My grandmother hid my mother and myself and my cousins and several aunts in a manure pit. It was like a small swimming pool. It had cemented sides to it and a cemented floor. And she had cleaned it out of the manure and put benches down on the bottom. And we sat there probably for several days. She had put boards on top of it and drove a wagon with hay there. And when the Russians came, and my grandmother, of course, spoke fluent Czech. And if you speak Czech, you also understand Russian. You can communicate with the Russians. And one of the corporals came and wanted to do harm to my grandmother. And one of the boys she had hired during the war said, "Not here." She was very good to us, this Mutti. And after that, my grandmother received food from the Russians. It was like sugar, something we hadn't seen in several years during the war. It was meat, jams, eggs, all the good things the Germans hadn't seen and weren't getting anymore as citizens of Germany. In 1942, America was forced into this war with the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. After the fiasco in Russia, Hitler took over the military. He killed all his generals because they didn't do the job he wanted them to do. And over the next 3 years, millions of Jews and other people who didn't abide by the laws of Hitler's Germany died in concentration camps. The Allies started to obliterate the larger cities toward the end of the war in Germany and also in Czechoslovakia. I remember spending more times in Luftschutzkeller in the basement every night when the sirens went off. We had to go down to the cellar to be safe, and many buildings fell around us, but miraculously our house just stood there and remained untouched. But people were losing faith during this time in the Reich and Hitler's leadership. Conspiracies came up to assassinate Hitler, but none of them succeeded. Himmler was supposed to combat this air of defeatism, and he ruthlessly sent people who complained at all to concentration camps to be exterminated. The German people were now killed by the Allied bombings and the German government. In 1944, the Allied forces landed on the coast of Normandy. Hitler and his Third Reich were doomed. The Russians had overrun the capital of Berlin from the east, and the Americans and the Brits were moving in from the west side. Germany was reduced to a few square miles around the Reichstag in Berlin. Hitler and his right-hand officers all committed suicide in their underground bunker. After 13 years of terror, Germany's Third Reich had come to a bitter end. In the final analysis, it was the Reich's own dogma of hatred, intolerance, and regression that ended the Reich. While in jail in the 1920s, Hitler wrote a book. It was called Mein Kampf, My Fight. And then in this book, he lined out everything that he had planned to do in Germany. If anybody in the parliament had read this book, they would have had the answer, and it could have been avoided much bloodshed. But the sentences were so long in this book that by the time you read one sentence, you had forgotten what the beginning was. So very few people had read this book. I attempted to read it, but I never went all the way through the book. But in the book he mentions that he was annexing more Lebensraum, more living space, and where was there to go but to the east in Europe. He talked about the sterilization of millions of inferior people with hereditary diseases who didn't fit into the Aryan model, what he had in mind. The Jew is the anti-man. They are subhuman and must be destroyed, with a final solution such as extermination camps, like Auschwitz and Dachau, Treblinka, Theresienstadt and Buchenwald. And when I took kids to Germany, I always made sure that they got to see one of the concentration camps, that they really realized that these times really happened. When the war was over, we were refugees from Czechoslovakia to Germany, and it taught me a great lesson, which I had never forgotten, that my mother had an education and she could make a living after that whole experience. And it taught me that you can buy everything else new, but if you have an education, nobody can go and take that away from you. As I said before, my mother and I, we went over the mountains during the night, and we hid during the day, I remember, and traveled in the dark at night. And the coat I wore had all of my mother's jewels sewn into the hems, into my hem, into my sleeves, into my collar. And finally we came to a destination, a town where a cattle train left for Germany, and we had just hoped that it would go to West Germany and not East Germany. It was a traumatic experience to get into a cattle train. Because it was the same way they transported the Jews into the concentration camps during the war. There were no seats, and people were packed in there like sardines. A man next to me had died probably several times or days before, and he was just left there. We prayed that this cattle car would end up in West Germany. We came into the mountain village where the only transport out was the milk truck. My mother walked for 5 hours through the woods to take the train to Göttingen, which was an English-occupied sector, and she gave piano lessons to British officers there who paid with chocolate and nylons and cigarettes. And I might say that Germany was divided into 4 sectors during that time. The Americans had a large western part of Germany. The Russians, of course, occupied the eastern part of Germany and weren't going to give up an inch. And the French had a small area at the Rhineland, Alsace-Lorraine, and the English had this part of Göttingen and the eastern part, southern part of Germany. During this time, nobody knew what to do with Germany. The French wanted their reparations, so did the English. They wanted to get out of Germany. The Russians wanted to have all of Germany, and the Americans created the Marshall Plan to save Germany. And this is how they became our friends, and also with the Luftbrücke in Berlin during that time. America and Germany became friendly people. And during one of those trips through the woods, my mother went through the woods and she found something, what she told me later about, and I want you to read the story about this. The war was lost to us, and we came to a new world of misery, despair, and hunger. As the tired lady got off the train, she realized what a long journey it would be through the woods. She had to walk briskly for more than 5 hours if she wanted to reach her destination, home where her little girl was eagerly waiting for her on Christmas Eve. Yes, tonight was Christmas Eve. There was nothing the lady with the stooped shoulders and weary features had to give to her little girl, who wished so longingly for a doll. Where could one get a doll in a land where people were starving and had no hope? How did a mother tell her only child that Christmas was passing them by this year? It started to snow softly. In the late afternoon dusk, the trees appeared like giants in glittering trees. How long the lady had walked and how far she didn't know, when all of a sudden her foot hit an obstacle in her path. She needed to rest anyway, so she searched for the root which had tripped her. It was not what she expected. There in the snow was an old battered box. She bent down and carefully scraped the snow and the ice away to see what might be in the box. Are there miracles in this world, or does God always know the secret hopes and wishes of His children? There in the box was a doll. It looked as if somebody had lost this treasure a long time ago, but mud and the elements had preserved the contents of the box, and the doll was almost new. Tears came to the woman's eyes. Her little girl would have that doll she so longingly wished for after all. She thanked God with all of her heart, and for many years to come, the doll was the most treasured toy for the little girl. Years later, my mother told me about this mysterious Christmas present. This is the doll.
Hi, America! Welcome to Real People. I'm the only real person here, though.
Tonight, from all over the world, with videotaped and filmed inserts from practically every place else, get ready to meet some more real people. Mark Russell takes us to the Merrimack Caverns in Missouri to find out if the infamous outlaw Jesse James has been alive until just recently. Our roving reporter Bill Rafferty talks to a lady in Minnesota who increases milk production by singing opera to her cows. And that's no bull. Sarah Purcell meets a couple who do their grocery shopping behind the supermarket, and that's no bull either. Byron Nadeline talks to Charlie Sampson, world champion bull rider. Charlie loves to climb aboard a mean two-ton bucking Brahma, and that's a lot of bull. Then Byron went for a ride himself. Usually Byron throws a lot of bull. This time it was the other way around. Then Sarah shows us a remarkable athlete who's run the Boston Marathon 50 times.
Our roving reporter Bill Rafferty has an unusual knack for discovering very unusual people.
Not so unusual. David does that every time he shaves.
What Bill has recently found is a lady who sings opera to her cows.
Now, that's unusual.
Not really. Lots of opera singers started that way, singing to cows.
Name one.
Cow Russo.
Oh, jeez.
David!
If you want to be a successful dairy farmer, somewhere along the line, you've got to figure out a way to keep your Holsteins happy. Faye Dickey of Leonard, Minnesota, population 50, has done just that. 20 years ago, Faye was a professional opera singer in Germany. But these days, the only place you'll hear Faye singing Carmen is in the cow barn. Faye Dickey has sung in front of packed opera houses throughout Europe. But for the past 4 years, she croons for no one but her cows, all 43 of them. And her singing keeps these cows utterly content. Faye hasn't lost her rich contralto voice, and obviously this bevy of bovine beauties have become devout opera lovers. Now, there is a method to this lady and her music. The average production yield for dairy cows in Minnesota is around 12,000 pounds per cow per year. Faye's cows average close to 16,000 pounds per cow per year. And some people might think the rugged life of a dairy farmer is no way to treat a lady, but Faye finds it an exciting and highly sophisticated job.
Now, these girls, usually before they're bred, we artificially breed them, and I do that also.
I don't understand that.
You buy the semen by choice. You look at a picture and you say, okay, this cow has bad feet, so you're going to have to choose a bull which has good feet. You have a picture book, and you look at it.
You do? Really?
Yes,
You go through and you pick the guy that you think is going to be the right...
The right match for this cow, sure. And you say, oh, she has a hanging bag or something, and you want her to have higher legs, and you use a bull, which is transmitting all these traits to the offspring.
Oh, makes sense.
And that's the bull you choose. And you can have them any price range from $10 up to $300 a straw, one straw. That's one shot of breeding.
How much?
To $300. There are some bulls which cost that much.
Working out.
Better get busy.
Oh, room service, girls. Oh, we've got something to keep those little waistlines aflutter. And to keep these Holsteins happy, each meal is served up with Faye's melodic munchies.
If I should live forever, until my dreams come true, my memories of love will be of you.
It seems like only yesterday Ben Cartwright and the boys had the Ponderosa. Today in the backwoods of Minnesota, Faye Dickey has the Dickarosa. You going to do this forever?
Oh, I couldn't tell you that now. Forever is a you know, a large term. But FHA and the bank are going to have me do it for a while. That's for sure. Perhaps love is like the ocean, full of conflict, full of pain. A fire when it's cold outside, thunder when it rains. If I should live forever until my dreams come true, my memories of love will be of you.
You know, Faye, I have been accused of milking a lot of stories, but in this case, I'm happy I did it. One of the girls has been outlaid.
How those cows respond to loving attention. It's great.
Yeah, but cows are like that. I once knew a farmer who could tell the time just by holding his cow's udder. I was amazed when I saw him do it.
Now, how in the world could he tell what time it was by holding the udder?
Well, I asked him that question.
You did?
And he said,
yeah,
easy. If I lift up the cow's udder like this, I could see the church clock over yonder.
My name is Felicitas Grunwald Dickey, and you can see why nobody calls me that. Nobody can pronounce it. and they either call me Fay or Felice in this country. I was born in a country that is no more. It was then called the Sudetenland, and it was created as a buffer zone between Germany and Czechoslovakia. During Hitler's reign in Germany, the Sudetenland was annexed to Germany. I was an only child with a German father and a Czech and Hungarian mother. My father's family belonged to the nobility of the country. Their land holdings came from a gift the Queen of Austria had bestowed on them. Her name was Sissi, and she gave all her poor relatives great land holdings in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. My mother, who came from a very humble background, was not considered a good match for my father. However, there was something very unique about my mother's family and their upbringing. My maternal grandmother believed in education, and she commenced to educate the girls as well as the boys. My mother showed great talent in music, so she was able to study music and go on for a doctorate at the University of Prague. Something in itself unheard of, because girls in those days got married and therefore only needed preparation for a marriage and not an education. My father was drafted to serve in the war, in World War II, and after Germany's aggression against Russia, my father was missing in action and never returned back home. I was 9 years old when the war was over. Czechoslovakia demanded that the Sudetenland would be returned to them, and all the Germans and anybody with German ties in their background had to leave the country without any of their belongings. My mother would have been able to stay, and she was offered a professorship at the music school in Prague. She didn't wish to live under communism or raise me in such an atmosphere. I remember walking over the mountains of the Riesengebirge in the middle of the night with just my clothes and a backpack. Finally, we connected with the transport of refugees to Germany. We were brought into Germany in cattle cars. The man next to me had died a long time ago. There was no room to lie down or sit. People kept holding each other upright. It was like sardines in a box. Luckily, we were dropped off in West Germany and assigned to a family on a farm at the end of the world in Rappoltshausen in the Knüll Mountains. My mother walked 5 hours by train to board the train to Göttingen, which was in the English zone at that time. There she gave piano lessons to officers for chocolate, nylons, and cigarettes, to buy food, because money was worthless during that time, and only the black market flourished. Germany had been so deprived during the war, and still was now. The people who had to take in refugees were not overjoyed, since they had very little food themselves. Gradually, my mother moved to the county seat. We moved into a 2-room apartment, a luxury at that time, since much of Germany was in rubble. And I remember our landlady had to go through the living room to get to her quarters in the back of the house. With the jewelry I had carried sewn into my coat seams as we went over the mountains, my mother traded these for a grand piano, and she started her piano studio. Since she was not German and didn't have to go to court to prove that she hadn't been a Nazi, she was hired as a professor of music at the Music Academy in Kassel. All these teaching openings couldn't be filled because most of the men remained in the war. For many years, she commuted by bus and by train to her job. During the end of the war and after, there was very little formal schooling for me. Yet my mother wanted me to attend the elite high school, the Gymnasium in Germany. I had had a lot of private tutoring during the war, and thus was able to pass the examination to be accepted. Only about 25% of all the kids go to high school in Germany. It was during that time that my maternal grandmother came to live with us, because all of her children had left Czechoslovakia, and so she elected to do the same. My grandmother ran our household and became my very best friend and confidant. She did homework with me every day, which annoyed me greatly at the time, until I realized she was doing it because she wanted to learn also with me. Pretty soon she spoke French better than I did, and she understood all the math problems better than I did. She also made sure I practiced piano every day for the many assigned hours my mother had on her list of things to do. My grandmother fell ill in my senior year of high school, and she never saw me graduate, which I really regret to this day. I then studied music, first at my mother's university, and then my final years in Munich at the Musikhochschule. I earned a music degree, which my first job singing opera was in Kassel, and that's when I met my husband, Howard, also. Marriage never entered my mother's mind, because she usually had her way to literally throw out all possible suitors. She thought it best that I pursue a career in opera. I was to have the career which was cut short for her. Because of the turmoil of the war, she never got to be the outstanding pianist she really was. Subconsciously, I knew if I was ever going to make a life for myself, it had to be away from my mother. I was an only daughter, and she put all her expectations into me. She was such a strong personality that she basically made all of my decisions for everything what there was. And I should maybe say here that my singing career was something I came to by sheer chance. In Germany, you have to audition to get into a studio for a renowned teacher. And there was an Italian teacher coming to my mother's university for 2 semesters. And my mother had a student who was very timid, but she had a lovely soprano voice. And so she needed to audition to get into his studio. And my mother said, "Oh, why don't you just sing a duet with my daughter?" And so we sang a duet. And he said, this Italian teacher said, "Yes, I'm going to take the young lady there, but I'm much more interested in your daughter." And my mother said, "My daughter is a piano major, and she has the violin as a minor. She can't sing. She never sang." And he said, "Well, just let me have her for a semester." And that semester decided my future. After that semester, people realized, hey, she can sing. And so that's when I decided to make an opera career out of it. At that time, when I met my husband, I was old enough to marry my husband without my mother's consent. And she had hidden all the papers. She gave us no papers at all to get married with, which I needed to marry an American. And my uncle at the time, he said, "Well, I will arrange for you to go to a lawyer who is a friend of mine, and he will give you documents saying that you lost all your papers through the war and that you can get married because you are of age. And so in the end, I had these papers, and I only knew my husband for 6 months. And he said to me, you know, once I'm leaving here, I'm not coming back. So if you marry me now, I'll take you with me, but otherwise I'm not going to come back for quite some time because I have to have an education first. And so my mother arranged that we got married in the Catholic Church, and I have no idea how she ever pulled that off. She must have bribed the priest with some money or something, because my husband certainly wasn't going to change and turn into the Catholic religion. But for my mother's sake, we had to get married in the Catholic Church, because otherwise she would have thought we weren't married. We started our married life in Rhode Island, my husband's home state. My mother had given me the advice not to expect a very warm welcome from my parents-in-law, since they didn't know me, and I was taking their son away from them, whom they hadn't seen in 4 years. And this was about the situation my mother had with my father, that they did not welcome her into my father's family. But to my surprise, just the opposite happened. I was accepted into that family as if I had lived with them forever. My husband went back to college on the GI Bill in the fall, and our son was born in December. And I should add there, I was kind of surprised at that my new family accepted me so well. And then I realized my husband must have been such a troublesome youngster that they were very glad to put that responsibility on somebody else's shoulders to worry about him. So when I left Germany, it was with the understanding that I would fulfill my contract with the Kassel Opera House. For several years, I spent my summers in Germany singing and working new material with my mother, who was my accompanist, and my coach. In the meantime, the International Podium in New York became my agent, and I was hired by the New York City Opera Company, which is a touring company. And basically, the way I was able to do that was my agent traded me and another singer from the opera company who wanted to go to Germany. She took my job in Kassel, Germany, and I took her job at the New York City Opera Company. And it worked out pretty well, for a while anyway. My husband's first job after he graduated from college, and for the last 2 years we had gone to Florida. He graduated from Florida State with a CPA in accounting. And his first job was for Price Waterhouse in New York. He gradually began to climb the corporate ladder, and in the 60s it demanded relocating just about every 2 years for a higher salary. We finally arrived in Ohio after we had lived in South Carolina, in Georgia, in Florida, and back to Ohio, and as we started out in New York and New Jersey. And so we needed to make some changes in our lives. My mother had passed away in December of 1968, and I traveled to Europe. My travels to Europe became very difficult through that I didn't have a headquarters there anymore. My husband was so disillusioned with corporate life and its intrigues. And it so happened that we were looking for land for an investment. The year before, we went to Arkansas to look at land, and in 1970, we came to Minnesota. As we started out in Duluth, we really didn't know what we wanted or what we were looking for. We just wanted to buy land. And then after they showed us all this recreational property, and my husband really wasn't somebody who would go fishing or hunting or do any of these things. We saw our first farm, and we realized for the same money, we could, what we spent on recreational property, we could have a whole farm with a barn, with buildings, and a tractor thrown into it also. My husband's farming dream quickly took possession of him, of both of us really. And so we bought a farm in Niebisch, strictly for investment. But on the way back to Ohio, my husband talked about the serenity and the beauty of Minnesota and our new land purchase. And I made the mistake and I said, and he would say, wouldn't it be nice to move there and not have all these worries or in the rat race, which had brought all these difficulties with it. And I made the mistake and I said, what's holding us? And my husband answered, of course, the money and our lifestyle. Oh, I said, we've done it before and we can do it again. And I felt a change in our lives, which had gotten so out of hand, was necessary. My husband took me up on it, and he resigned just before his company went off the stock market. My contract was up in the 70s also, and I needed to decide, am I going to resign, renew this contract, or am I just going to do something else? And as I was taking a serious look at our growing family and the transportation means in Minnesota, at that time in the 70s, there was one airplane out of Bemidji daily. So I decided I had enough and I needed to stay close to home and raise my children myself. So we moved from a 15-room house into a dilapidated farmhouse in Niebisch. We managed an addition on the house which contained a bathroom, a garage, and running water. We heated with a wood stove during that winter, and that was an experience in itself. The first year we bought 5 Angus cows, and it was so cold that winter, it was 50 below many times, that we lost 3 of them immediately. The remaining 2 also fell ill, and I brought the last living cow into the kitchen because that was the warmest place I could think of. That animal had the audacity to live in my kitchen for almost 2 weeks while we basically swung from the rafters to get to our refrigerator, and then she still died. It didn't take too long to realize that we needed much more money than we had to farm. My husband went back to work in Detroit while I attended BSU as a special student because I had a degree from Germany, but the universities in Germany do not give grades. They ask for a state exam, so when you can pass the state exam, then you have your degree. So at BSU, I had to establish everything through exams to see what grade I would get. So for instance, I had 29 credits on the violin, and I hadn't played the violin in years, and I hated the violin. And so I went to see Dr. Sellen, and she said, I said, does this come back to you? And she said, yes, it should. So I practiced for about 5 weeks, and my children shook their head and said, Mother, we don't think you're going to get any better, just get it over with. And so I went, and she gave me an A for the 29 credits, and I did the same thing with piano and everything else. And I tested out of everything what was possible to test out. At BSU, I was the first one and probably the only one in many years to take the CLEP test, which is the English test where you test out of 12 credits of English which you would have had to take every day for the next 3 years. And I passed it because I had had English for 9 years in a high school in Germany. And so I ended up, after 2 years, I ended up with a vocal music degree, a degree in German and English. And over the summers, I got myself a junior high science degree to teach 7th and 8th grade science also. So my first job was in Cass Lake, where I was strictly hired to build a concert choir. But the experience would lend itself to something else, because my first job was also in Bina, in Cass Lake, and it was an unbelievable job, and I was a rookie teacher. And it was just so unbelievable that somebody else would have resigned probably in the middle of the year. The workload was just unreal. And at the time we lived in Niebisch until 1976, and my brother-in-law, who was a pilot and never flew, lived in Pennsylvania, and he came up to Minnesota, and he wanted to buy a farm to change his lifestyle and move to Minnesota. And the real estate man who sold us the Niebisch place found us 2 farms close together in Leonard, and we bought them. We bought a farm with a larger barn and a smaller house, and my brother-in-law bought a bigger house and no barn at all. And a whole new era of living in Minnesota began for us, with realizing that our farm had been set up for a dairy farm. Now we are living in Leonard on a farm with a beef herd, and the beef herd always kept running off because we didn't have any fences. One of those evenings, when I went to get one of my heifers at a neighbor's farm, they were milking their cows. And I sat on a straw bale there, watching them milk their cows. And such a feeling of peace came over me that it was just overwhelming. Something in my mind said to me, this is something I would like to do. My husband, Howard, was working in Detroit, Michigan at the time, because the money we needed to finance our farm enterprise was not in this area. And it couldn't be earned in Leonard, and it couldn't be earned in Bemidji. When he called that next evening, I asked him what he would say if I sold the beef cattle and purchased some dairy cows. My argument was that the barn on our farm was set up for dairy. Matter of fact, the farmer we bought the farm from milked cows a month before he sold the farm to us. Of course, he had sold all the milk equipment, and we had to start from scratch. He told me, do what you think is right. Just use your good judgment. Well, I didn't have to be told twice. I started going to auctions and bought a small milk tank, which would fit into our very small milk house. I whitewashed the old barn walls and limed the floors. The barn was getting ready for cows. I checked the papers and planned to buy 5 cows to start out with. But then fate came my way in the form of a farmer who had to sell his whole herd because of health reasons. Well, I didn't even have enough room in our barn for 30 cows. I told him if he could find somebody to buy the other half of his herd, I would buy probably 15 of them, with one condition. I had never milked a cow in my life, nor did I grow up on a farm. We had learned everything by trial and error so far on the farm. He was very kind, this farmer, and he hired me on as his milkmaid for a month, milking morning and night. That at least gave me a taste what it would be like to do this morning and night forever. The cows came into our barn, and the next morning I just about cried because they all were so dirty. The barn they had come from was a brand new barn. It had deep gutters and long stanchions. Our old barn was none of that, and besides, we didn't have a barn cleaner in the barn either. Looking at the whole problem, that barn probably was built for much smaller cows than Holsteins. I realized very soon that the former owners of these cows had handpicked the most gentle cows for me and his top producers. Thus we started out with a very good dairy herd. But there was just too many cows in a very small barn. Again, fate came my way in the form of a very friendly FHA agent who thought we needed to build a new barn and milk more cows. The old barn was not worth the remodel because it was located in a ditch and the water ran into it when it rained hard. My husband thought for sure I had lost my marbles for good this time. Being an accountant, he pointed out to me that we didn't have that much equity in the farm to take on such a debt load. But with my determined German mind, I replied, "What if I can get the money to build this barn? Will you go along with it?" And he said, "If anybody wants to give you money, I would be foolish not to go along with it. But just understand, the cows are your idea." From that moment on, we both prepared for our new barn with enthusiasm. I visited a barn a day for at least a month and jotted everything down what I liked about it and how it would go to his job. And he worked on the Red Lake Reservation. He was their grant writer and accountant for the CAP program. And he used his spare time to design the barn, what he thought we could afford. It had to be the stanchion barn because we wanted our cows to be individual pampered. I couldn't see where that could be done in a freestall like many people had. I was looking at their barns at. After many trials and tribulations, we had our barn finished, and it was tribulations, if you ask me. We had the most modern manure handling system there was in the northern hemisphere here. We had a barn cleaner going around and dumping the manure into a big hopper where a piston pump delivered the manure onto a slab of cement as large as a tennis court. The pipeline going through the barn was low enough for me because it was built for me. That I didn't need to have a footstool to stand on to connect my milk hoses. Talking about a learning experience, my husband's job description was feeding the cows, rations designed by the milk testers. That was a whole new experience, the whole thing. The milk testers came once a month, and that's how you would know how to cull a cow, whether you want to keep them or do them. It was a scientific kind of thing. I learned to breed the cows, choose the bulls. It was like the stock market, whether you could catch a good bull and a good cow and a good offspring. Creating the best alfalfa hay was a problem in this area because the seasons are too short and it mostly rains at the most impossible times. And planting corn for silage and going to a full-time job. In the meantime, I had gotten a job in Clearbrook. The principal came to me and asked me if I wanted to build a German program. And after my Cass Lake experience, I was never going to teach again. Absolutely not. And he said to me, you know, I come from New Ulm, and everybody speaks German there, so I want a German program in my school. And of course, in order to build this program, you have to do everything else first, because you have to get the kids there. I started out this job with 2 classes of German, and then he threw me also junior high English, because he didn't have anybody to teach that. My junior high choir outsang the concert choir, and the school board said Mrs. Dickey should do the concert choir, so I ended up with the concert choir. So I did everything under the sun in the Clearbrook-Gonwick School before I had 4 years of German. My agreement with the school board was, if I can get the kids to take the language, I can get the classes. And I had 4 years of German, which is unheard of in a high school. Starting in 9th grade, and I built it. I went during my prep hour to the elementary school and taught 20-minute sessions there for elementary kids, and they could hardly wait to get into German by the time they were in 9th grade. And most of my kids stayed with me. And then we added an AP class to the 4 years. And we also had an exchange program with a Berlin school. In Berlin, they came as a 10th grade in October, the whole class. That was part of their curriculum to come to Clearbrook. And I thought to myself, this is gonna be a fiasco. Kids from the largest town in Germany coming to Clearbrook, and it was a happening. The kids just loved it. They got to ride 4-wheelers, they got to go fishing, they got to play basketball, things what you don't do in a German school at all. And some of them even married their exchange girls. So it was a real success, and our kids went to the same families as these kids came into in Germany, and we usually went over Easter. And there was a part of the traveling was often done by the families they stayed with, and they went to school for 2 weeks, 2-3 weeks, and it was just a real nice exchange. And I did probably as much fundraising as I did teaching during this time. We sold everything under the sun. We did dinners, we did dances, we did fruit sales for Christmas, and the kids learned to work. And it was nice for the school, for the community, and for the kids, mainly. Okay, but going back to the dairy farm, my job description in the barn was to milk the cows with the help of our daughters, breed the cows, which I had learned via a workshop, pick the right bulls to have better offsprings, which I could sell on the market, keep accurate records, and have a part-time teaching job to support our cows. Now, we both had outside jobs. My husband had a full-time job. Mine turned into a full-time job to support our cows. Now, how stupid is that? Our son was in college at the time and only came home weekends and sometimes during the summer. But since we couldn't pay him very much, he opted to get jobs with the University of Minnesota to make the big bucks to see himself through college much of the time. Our daughter Stephanie eventually got to be so good at this farming job that she became the 32nd Princess K of the Milky Way, the only Princess K we ever had in our area up here. These girls represent the dairy industry for a whole year, and it gave her a direction in life. She majored in communications and marketing. And our youngest one, Sabrina, our youngest daughter's job was, her job description was to get the cows, bring them in the barn, close the stanchions. She also took care of the calves and came out in the morning before school and she ran the barn cleaner, which was a push-button kind of affair. She was 13 at the time when our barn was brand new. By chance, somebody found out that I was an opera singer in a former lifetime, and it was Marilyn Haggerty, a feature writer from the Grand Forks Herald. She called me and wanted an interview on the farm. She just mentioned in her article that I also sang to my cows. This little tidbit was picked up by two fellows who wanted to know if I really sang to the cows and what I sang. I told them mostly opera. That is what I used to be and do, singing opera on European stages. They asked if they could come out to the farm and film it. They happened to be Bill Rafferty, and the producer was Reed Parker from the NBC show Real People. They arrived on December 13th, 1982, for an all-day taping session on our farm. I had no idea that this was such a big deal. So I didn't inform the area papers to come and take their pictures of the event. Needless to say, they were a little upset. They were quite upset with me. When they left, these video people, they told me that this segment would make national news. I thought they were a little off there. However, it was not very long down the road when my husband's relatives saw the first segment on the East Coast in Boston, New York, and Pennsylvania. Friends and relatives called us to tell us what a fun TV feature that was and how much they enjoyed it. Pretty soon it appeared on the West Coast, and our friends from there called us, and finally it was featured in the Midwest. Overnight I had become a celebrity as the opera singer singing dairy farmer. People recognized me and told me how much they loved that story. After that, I was invited to do a show in Toronto, Canada, appearing on Claim to Fame. The same company produced What's My Line. The celebrity panel, I had to guess what the three contestants did. A woman had won the husband hollering contest. The other one was the fastest talking man in the world, and I sang opera to my cows. And I was the only known opera singing dairy farmer who sings to her dairy herd. I won because nobody on the celebrity panel thought that anybody would be that crazy and sing to their cows. I also was invited to do many local TV shows and Good Morning America, and also a broadcast with NPR Minnesota, Country Morning. The same lady, Marilyn Haggerty, who started all this, called me last week, and she asked to do a follow-up feature in the Grand Forks Herald 25 years later. I asked her, how old are you, that you haven't retired yet? And she said she was 81 years old and still wrote feature stories for the Herald. What an amazing woman she was. I would like to close with something else. We should have probably charged admission many times. We were farmers who had no idea what we're doing. So we read a lot. We tried a lot of things. By trial and error, we learned. We had the first hay barn. The farmers in my area still farmed like 100 years ago. And I'd look at that, and my husband would look at it and would say, shake our head and say, why aren't they doing this? And I give you just one example. They would load up their sacks of grain on their truck. They'd go into town, unload it at the elevator, have it ground, drink coffee all morning long, get their sacks back and go back to their barn. And I thought, now how stupid is that? All this wasted time. You know, we couldn't do that because we had outside jobs. And so we had the first grain bin on our barn where the co-op delivered our feed already fixed for the cows and everything, so we didn't have to go and do that step going into town and bringing our own feed there to be ground. Another example would be we had the first hay bine. Farmers in my area still cut hay with a sickle, with a scythe, and then they took and turned it over and knocked off all the leaves, and all the nutrients went off the stems there. The hay bine is something what crops the hay and keeps it so that it is dried underneath, and none of these farmers thought that that would work. So the first time we used that hay bine of ours, we drew a crowd. We had all these farmers lined up watching. We should have charged admission. And so that was just one of the examples. And I would go to auctions, let's say, and they knew I had a registered dairy herd. I had registered cows, and my cows were top-notch. And the old farmers would always watch me and see what I would bid on. And they would often outbid me because they thought, well, I was bidding on the best cows. And that was just kind of a hilarious kind of thing. I was the first president Land O'Lakes elected to their board, which had never been done before. No woman was ever elected to do jobs like that. So that was my dairy experience. And what do you suppose was the reward of all this pleasure of dairy farming? All our children turned out well because of hard work and problem-solving skills they learned on that farm. Our son and our daughter-in-law, Catherine, took over the dairy farm in 1989. And they milked cows until 1996 and gave it up, and probably thought I was beating my hired help because you really couldn't find anybody who wanted to work on a dairy farm. They also have both outside jobs, and now they raise quarter horses. I wouldn't want to miss that segment from my memory life, which is dairy farming, and I'm sure that our children feel that it enriched their young existence growing up on a farm. I grew up in Czechoslovakia during World War II, but I came to Germany after the war as a refugee with my mother, and my grandmother joined us a year later. Germany is a tourist country with extraordinarily variety of charming scenery. Extending from the North Sea to the Bavarian Alps, one can experience wide, open lowlands, upland plains, and high mountain ranges. And one can drive all this in one day and see the changes of scenery. Germany is situated in the heart of Europe. It consists of 7 federal states, similar to our states here in America. Its capital is Berlin. I grew up in the state of Hesse and studied in Bavaria, Bayern, Germany, and it shares borders with the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg and France in the west, and Switzerland and Austria in the south, and the Czech Republic and Poland in the east. Germany's borders have been largely determined by historical and political developments rather than physical geography. Partly because of their geographical locations, partly of their different histories and resulting traditions, the various regions in Germany not only look different from each other, but also each state has their own traditions, architecture, food, and culture. Their culture is characteristic by much diversity. Every region has its own culinary heritage. The cuisine is much different in Bavaria from that of the northern regions. Standard or High German is spoken throughout the country, but folks also speak their own regional dialects. As you probably know, Germany and English are both Germanic languages, and the German developed slowly over the years from the English. Took me to graduate school to realize that one. Germany, as many other languages, have a formal and intimate address. The formal Sie in German is used for people you do not know so well, and the familiar Du. Usually young people use the familiar Du among each other. They also like to shake hands whenever they see each other again. Usually they make a big production of drinking Bruderschaft when they go from the formal Sie into the German Du familiar address. The Germans love their festivals and celebrate them throughout the year. The most wonderful celebration of all is Weihnachten, Christmas. Of course, it is a beloved holiday in many countries. However, in Germany, Christmas is celebrated with vigor and dedication. The origins of Christmas traditions are traced back to pre-Christian Germanic tribes. Christmas is celebrated today. It became popular after the 14th century, and most of the German Christmas customs originated during the Middle Ages and varied from region to region. Even when we had very little to eat, Christmas was celebrated in our home with music, baking, visiting, and much holiday spirit. I remember it so fondly as the most festive and contemplative time of the year, with an atmosphere of serenity and much love. There was a magic in the air, and the Spirit of God's Son arriving soon was celebrated. The German Christmas season is very lengthy. It starts on November 30th, and it winds down on January 13th, the octave of Epiphany, allowing people plenty of time to enjoy the wonderful Christmas season. Christmas began with the Advent, which was introduced by Martin Luther in the 15th century by making an Advent wreath out of branches with 4 candles. The Advent wreath was placed usually on our coffee table in the living room. We lit a candle on the first Sunday in December, and on each successive Sunday, another candle was lit until all 4 were glowing to remind us of the coming of the Christ child on Weihnachtsabend, on Christmas Eve. We also had an Advent calendar to count the days until the Christ child arrived. My grandmother started to bake cookies and breads in September to have enough to give neighbors, friends, and also entertain visitors who often arrived on Advent Sundays. We usually sang Christmas carols with my mother playing the piano and I the violin. Music was such an important part in celebrating all aspects of the Christmas season in our home. And each year, people from all over the world travel to Germany to experience the delights of a German Christmas at its famous Christmas markets. From Germany's blown glass ornaments to its authentic gingerbread houses, to the roasting of chestnuts and warm Glühwein, to its German Christmas trees covered in real candles. There are few places where one can soak in the Christmas spirit and enjoy an old-fashioned German Christmas. A much different tradition is actually the Christmas tree. While much of the world uses electric lights to illuminate their Christmas trees, as in my childhood to this day, one can still find German homes that use traditional candles, real candles, to light up their Christmas trees. In our home, the tree was not lit until the door opened to the living room on Heiligabend, on the Holy Christmas Eve, which is the 24th of December. The Christmas tree, as we know it, originated in Germany. It has a mysterious magic for the young, because they are all allowed to see it. They're not allowed to see it until Christmas Eve. Our tree at home was decorated with candy and Lebkuchen and marzipan and cookies and exquisite glass-blown decorations and family treasures. When all is ready, a bell is rung for the children to enter this Christmas fantasy room. Everyone who visits at Christmas time got something off the tree to eat. You can imagine what the tree looked like by New Year. Much of Christmas tree history is a fact, it's credited to Germany for either starting the traditions or perfecting them. The legend has it that the first tree was cut by Martin Luther for his children. In the 1600s, trees were decorated with colored paper, small toys, food, and candles. Later, silver wire ornaments, candles, and small beads became common German Christmas decorations. The earliest written record of an evergreen tree being decorated for Christmas is 1521 in the German region of Alsace-Lorraine, which had a forest ordinance saying that no one shall have for Christmas more than one bush of more than 8 shoes length. There's a little question that the German Christmas tradition originated and popularized the use of the Christmas tree. As German people immigrated to other countries, they took their traditions with them. By the 1700s, the German Christmas tree, the Christbaum, had spread to other parts of Europe and eventually made its way to the United States. Carols, of course, are a big part of the German Christmas tradition. Many of these carols have been translated into multiple languages and are being sung all over the world. 2 examples would be Silent Night, Stille Nacht, and O Tannenbaum, O Christmas Tree. And the story of Silent Night is Silent Night was written by a pastor from Oberstdorf in the Bavarian Alps, the Tyrolean Alps actually. And his organ was disabled for Christmas Eve, and he didn't have anything to offer his congregation. So he found the song he had written a long time ago, Stille Nacht. And one of his friends suggested they could perform it with a guitar. And that was the first time a guitar was used in a church building for Christmas. And it was performed there, and from there it spread all over the southern regions first of Germany, and then it conquered the world, actually. This is a song what is sung in many, many countries. A much different tradition is that St. Nicholas comes on the 6th of December. As in many other European countries, on the 6th of December, children place a shoe by the fireplace or out the door. During the night, St. Nicholas, the patron saint of children, goes from house to house and fills the shoes with candies. However, if the children have been good during the year, if they have been bad during the year, they only find twigs in their shoes. St. Nicholas is described as a bishop who lived in the 4th century. According to legend, he gave endowments to the 3 daughters of an impoverished nobleman. It also was a day during the Middle Ages for charitable giving. In my area, St. Nicholas actually came to the house in person with his helper, Knecht Ruprecht, and often he was displayed as a Kremlin. If you had been good, it was gifted with candies and small toys, and if you had been bad, Knecht Ruprecht, who was like a Kremlin, used his switch on your behind, and he would paddle you. One Christmas, I wanted the doll so badly, and I knew that I had little chance to get one. In those days, my mother gave piano lessons to all the farm children on the Knoll Mountains. Money was worthless during that time, so the farmers paid her with food staples such as ham and meat, apples, eggs, even milk to pay for the lessons. She walked through the woods to do this, and many times I came along. But on that particular weekend, I had stayed behind. Finally, the long-awaited day arrived, and Christmas Eve came. In the morning and early afternoon of December 24th, it's called Heiligabend, the Holy Evening, the preparations for the big event were completed. The magic moment was here. The most exciting time for the children came when they had to wait in their rooms until the Christkind, the Christ child, arrived. Children wore their best dresses and white stockings, and I remember when I was called into the living room and saw the Christmas tree in all its splendor for the first time with presents under the tree. And the presents often weren't wrapped. Often my dolls received new wardrobes and perhaps a baby carriage, and there always were books to read. One year I received a dollhouse one of my mother's students had carved. It had miniature furniture and parents and children. I treasured that dollhouse for many, many years. Christkindl had been there and left again quietly through the window. We had a supper with certain meaningful foods for Christmas to bless us in the coming year. A big part was the church service at midnight. I was raised in the Catholic church, and at midnight, while the church bells were ringing, we attended the Christmas service for the arrival of the Christ child. We lived on top of a mountain in Germany, and often we slid to the church with a sled. Of course, after the service, we had to pull the sled back home also. That was a lot of fun and very memorable to me to this day. According to legend, on Christmas Eve in Germany, rivers turn into wine, animals speak to each other, tree blossoms bear fruit, mountains open up to reveal precious gems, and church bells can be heard ringing from the bottom of the sea. Of course, only the pure of heart can witness this Christmas magic. All others must content themselves with traditional German celebrations. Christmas Day, which is the first of 2 Christmas holidays. The families enjoy a festive meal of baked goose with gravy and mashed potatoes or knödel, which are dumplings, and always red cabbage. For dessert, there is Weihnachtsstollen. It's a rich, fruity, loaf-shaped Christmas bread, and it's dusted with powdered sugar. In the afternoon, children recite poems about Christmas, or the family sings Christmas songs. Often on the second Christmas holiday, my mother and I went skiing. Sometimes we even spent a week skiing in the mountains either with friends or in a ski resort. One of these Christmas poems I had was my favorite, but it is in German, and so I'm going to just leave it out. And then you have Sylvester. Sylvester is New Year's Eve. And the families gather together on Sylvester, and usually they eat fish for the evening meal. Pretzels are also a favorite, and folks, they sip wine or champagne throughout the night. Games are being played, and it is customary to have Bleigießen, which is pouring of powder, of pewter. I'm sorry. The pewter is heated up, and it's dropped on a fireproof dish, and from there it is put into water. And it is often very exciting to watch the shapes which will form and appear. The pewter figures are an omen for the coming year or even your life. One year, a boat appeared when I poured my pewter, so I knew that I would eventually travel to foreign lands. At midnight, folks toast to each other with champagne for a good new year, ein gutes neues Jahr. And little marzipan pigs, Schweinchen, or chimney sweeps with a clover leaf are presented to family members and friends for good luck in the new year. My childhood in Germany is a picture of the past. Growing up in Germany after the war, a country rich with history, culture, and traditions, instilled in me important values, which I carry with me into my new life in America a long time ago. I met so many people who enriched my life and expanded my horizons in regard to understanding and respecting others from different parts of the world. I discovered the beauty of human diversity here in America. We all have to appreciate our differences and celebrate where we came from. Our responsibility as human beings is to leave the world a better place, full of tolerance, harmony, and peace. We have to remind ourselves that we only have this moment in our life. The present is a present from our God. Let us remind ourselves that each of us is a unique human being, and we each contribute in our own way. Let us live in the moment and enjoy this Christmas especially, and remember that Christ is the reason for the season.